The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor as Victoria Sterling threw it down in disgust. Another clumsy waitress, another ruined moment at his exclusive charity gala. He grabbed the young woman's wrist, his voice dripping with contempt. "Do you have any idea who I am? I could buy and sell your pathetic life 1,000 times over." The waitress, Elena Rodriguez according to her name tag, looked up at him with startling calm. No tears, no apology, just those strange, knowing eyes that seemed to hold secrets he couldn't imagine. When she quietly asked for his company's stock symbol, Sterling laughed. "Why? Planning to buy shares with your tip money?" By morning, his empire was gone. The nobody waitress had just executed the largest corporate takeover in history. And Sterling was about to learn that some people hide in plain sight for very dangerous reasons. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story of hidden power and ultimate justice intrigues you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more tales of those who serve from the shadows. Elena Rodriguez adjusted the black bow tie of her server's uniform, checking her reflection in the polished steel of the service elevator. 27 floors up in Manhattan's most exclusive hotel, the Meridian Grand was hosting another glittering charity gala for New York's wealthiest elite. To anyone watching, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a part-time waitress working to pay her way through Columbia's business school. The lie was perfect because it contained just enough truth to be believable. The elevator opened onto a scene of calculated opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over women in designer gowns and men in custom tuxedos, all gathering around silent auction tables displaying everything from African safaris to private wine tastings in French chateaux. The combined net worth of the guests likely exceeded the GDP of small nations, yet they were here ostensibly to raise money for underprivileged children's education. Elena picked up her tray of champagne flutes, moving through the crowd with practiced invisibility. In her 3 months working these events, she'd perfected the art of being seen but not noticed, present but not important. It was a skill that served her true purpose far better than any of these people could imagine. She observed the subtle hierarchies playing out across the ballroom. Victoria Sterling commanded the center of attention, his silver hair perfectly styled, his custom Tom Ford tuxedo immaculate. At 52, Sterling had built a media empire worth $12 billion, starting with a small cable company inherited from his father and expanding into streaming services, social media platforms, and digital news networks that shaped public opinion across 3 continents. Sterling moved through his guests like a master of ceremonies, his laugh too loud, his handshakes too firm, every gesture calculated to remind others of his importance. Elena had studied him for months, learning his patterns, his weaknesses, his carefully guarded secrets. The education of disadvantaged children, Sterling was saying to a cluster of admirers, is not just charity, it's an investment in America's future. When we lift up the least fortunate, we strengthen the foundation of our entire society. The irony was breathtaking. Sterling's media companies had spent the past decade systematically undermining public education funding, supporting politicians who cut school budgets while funneling money toward private institutions that served the wealthy. His streaming platforms promoted anti-intellectual content that glorified ignorance, while his news networks spread disinformation that made critical thinking increasingly rare. Elena approached with her tray, offering champagne to Sterling's group. She moved slowly, professionally, giving her enhanced hearing devices time to capture their conversation clearly. "The key," Sterling continued, accepting a glass without acknowledging her presence, "is making sure the money goes to programs that actually work. Too much educational funding is wasted on ineffective teachers and outdated methods." Margaret Ashford, wife of a pharmaceutical CEO, nodded approvingly. "Exactly. We can't just throw money at problems. We need accountability, metrics, results." "Which is why," Sterling said, his voice taking on a more confidential tone, "my foundation focuses on charter schools and private educational initiatives. Places where we can ensure our donations create real change, not just fuel bureaucratic waste." Elena almost smiled at the euphemism. Sterling's foundation did indeed fund private educational initiatives, specifically political campaigns that promoted school privatization, lobbying efforts that directed public education funds to for-profit companies, and think tanks that produced research justifying the dismantling of public schools. She continued serving, invisible to the conversation that was reshaping educational policy across multiple states. The guests talked around her as if she were furniture, their voices carrying details about political donations, regulatory capture, and coordinated media campaigns designed to convince parents that public education was failing their children. The beauty of the current approach, Sterling was explaining, is that we're not just changing policy. We're changing public perception. When parents lose faith in public schools, they become our allies in reformation. Reform. Another euphemism for privatization, for the systematic transfer of public resources to private profit. Elena moved on to the next group, her presence barely registering as she documented conversations that would have caused scandals if recorded by journalists. But journalists weren't invited to these events, and even if they were, they wouldn't have access to the private conversations that revealed the true machinery of power. Near the silent auction tables, she overheard Sterling's CFO discussing the company's latest acquisition strategy. The streaming wars are just beginning, Marcus Webb was saying. Victoria wants to consolidate the market before the next round of regulatory hearings. Regulatory hearings? Asked Senator Patricia Hawthorne, her voice carrying the practiced concern of a politician accustomed to managing public perception. Antitrust concerns, Webb explained. Nothing serious, but we want to control as much market share as possible before Congress starts making noise about monopolies. Senator Hawthorne laughed. Marcus, you know as well as I do that those hearings are theatre. My committee will ask the right questions, Victoria will give the right answers, and everyone will go home satisfied that we're protecting consumers. Elena served champagne to the group, noting how Hawthorne had just admitted that upcoming antitrust hearings were predetermined theatre. The Senators' Committee was supposed to provide oversight of media consolidation, not coordinate with the companies they were meant to regulate. Still, Webb continued, Victoria wants to accelerate the timeline. The Hartley Media Group has been resistant to our acquisition offers, but they're vulnerable after their streaming platform failed to gain traction. Financial pressure? Hawthorne suggested. Among other approaches, Webb replied meaningfully. Elena recognized the implication. Sterling's companies were known for using their media platforms to create negative coverage of acquisition targets, manipulating stock prices and public perception to force favorable deals. It wasn't illegal, exactly, but it represented a level of market manipulation that would horrify regulators, if regulators weren't already compromised. The evening continued with similar revelations. Elena documented plans to suppress coverage of environmental disasters caused by Sterling's corporate partners, strategies to influence election outcomes through targeted disinformation campaigns, and coordination between Sterling's news networks and political campaigns that violated numerous election laws. All of this information flowed around her like water around a stone, the participants so confident in their privacy that they spoke openly about activities that could destroy careers and trigger federal investigations. As the night progressed, Elena noticed Sterling becoming increasingly intoxicated. His voice grew louder, his gestures more expansive, his filter gradually disappearing. This was when mistakes happened, when carefully guarded secrets slipped out in moments of unguarded arrogance. She was refilling champagne glasses at a table near the ballroom center when disaster struck, or rather, when she made it appear to strike. A carefully timed stumble, a precisely angled collision, and a full tray of champagne cascaded across Sterling's custom tuxedo. The ballroom fell silent as Sterling stood dripping, his face cycling through shock, rage, and humiliation. Every eye in the room focused on the scene. Every conversation stopped. Every phone discreetly turned toward the confrontation. "You clumsy idiot!" Sterling roared, grabbing Elena's wrist with enough force to leave bruises. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Elena maintained her submissive posture, her eyes downcast, playing the role of a terrified service worker. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean..." "Didn't mean?" Sterling's voice carried across the silent ballroom. "I could buy and sell your pathetic life 1,000 times over, This tuxedo cost more than you make in a year." The cruelty was casual, automatic, delivered with the kind of entitlement that came from never facing consequences for treating others as less than human. Around the ballroom, guests watched with expressions ranging from discomfort to amusement, but none moved to intervene. "Sir," Elena said quietly, her voice barely audible, "please let go of my arm." Sterling's grip tightened instead. "Do you know what your little accident just cost me? This is a custom Armani, you stupid girl. Hand-tailored in Milan. Worth more than your college education, assuming you're even smart enough for college." Elena looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his for the first time. What Sterling saw there should have given him pause, a depth of intelligence and calculation that didn't belong in a waitress's gaze, but his rage blinded him to everything except his own humiliation. "I'll pay for the cleaning," Elena offered quietly. "I'll work extra shifts." "Cleaning?" Sterling laughed harshly. "You think this can be cleaned? This is ruined, completely ruined, just like everything else you people touch." The racist undertone in "you people" sent a ripple of discomfort through the crowd. Even by the standards of Sterling's usual arrogance, this was excessive. Elena Rodriguez had olive skin and dark hair that suggested Latina heritage that Sterling was now using as a weapon. "Perhaps," Elena said, her voice still quiet but carrying a strange new quality, "you could tell me your company's stock symbol. I'd like to make this right." Sterling's laughter was explosive, cruel. "Stock symbol? What, are you planning to buy shares with your tip money? Going to become an investor?" He turned to his audience, inviting them to share his amusement. "This little waitress wants to play with the big boys." Several guests laughed uncomfortably, while others looked away in embarrassment. Margaret Ashford whispered to her husband, clearly disturbed by the public spectacle. "STLR," Sterling said mockingly. "Sterling Media Corporation, traded on NASDAQ. Maybe you can buy yourself a single share if you save up your tips for a few years." Elena nodded gravely, as if filing away important information. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I'll remember that." Something in her tone penetrated Sterling's alcohol-fueled rage. For a moment he studied her face more carefully, noting the composure that seemed wrong for someone in her position. But the moment passed, overwhelmed by his need to reassert dominance. "Security," he called. "Remove this woman from my event, and make sure she's banned from working any venue I might attend." 2 hotel security guards approached reluctantly. They looked uncomfortable with the situation, but Sterling's influence made defiance impossible. "Ma'am," one of them said gently, "we need you to come with us." Elena nodded with dignity, setting down her tray and walking toward the exit without protest. As she passed tables of New York's elite, she maintained perfect posture, her head high despite the humiliation. Several guests watched her departure with expressions of sympathy or admiration for her grace under pressure. Sterling returned to his celebration, accepting congratulations from sycophants who praised his handling of the situation. The incident became another story of his power, his refusal to tolerate incompetence, his natural authority. What none of them knew was that Elena Rodriguez had just executed the opening move in the most sophisticated corporate takeover in Wall Street history. Outside the hotel, Elena walked 3 blocks before entering a black sedan that had been waiting for her. Inside, she found Marcus Chen, her chief financial officer, reviewing real-time market data on multiple screens. "How did it go?" Marcus asked without looking up. "Perfectly," Elena replied, removing the black bow tie and letting her hair down. "He gave me the stock symbol himself. STLR, NASDAQ. Current price? $47.38, Marcus replied. Down 2 points from yesterday's close. The quarterly earnings report disappointed investors. Elena smiled for the first time all evening. Excellent. Initiate Phase 1. What happened next occurred faster than most observers could follow. At 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time, a series of shell companies began purchasing Sterling Media Corporation stock through dark pools and international markets. The purchases were carefully structured to avoid triggering disclosure requirements, using techniques that skirted the edge of securities law without crossing into illegality. By 2:30 a.m., Elena's network had acquired nearly 15% of Sterling's company without appearing on any radar that might alert his management team. The purchases continued through overseas markets as American exchanges closed, taking advantage of time zone differences and regulatory gaps between countries. At 6 a.m., Sterling's phone began ringing. His head of security called first, reporting unusual trading activity in the company's stock. His CFO called 20 minutes later, his voice tight with panic. "Victoria, we have a problem. Someone's been buying our shares all night. Large positions, coordinated purchases across multiple markets." Sterling rolled out of bed in his Park Avenue penthouse, his hangover making concentration difficult. "How large?" "We're not sure yet. The purchases are being disguised through international proxies and shell companies, but trading volume was 10 times normal overnight." "Who's buying?" "That's the problem. We can't identify the purchaser. Everything's being routed through offshore entities with layers of corporate protection." Sterling felt the first stab of genuine concern. Hostile takeovers required careful choreography, months of planning, regulatory filings that gave targets time to prepare defenses. This was different, a stealth attack that seemed to come from nowhere. "Get everyone in the office," he ordered. "Emergency board meeting at 8 o'clock, and find out who's behind this." By 7:30 a.m., Sterling's war room was assembled. His top executives, legal team, and financial advisors filled the conference room on the 42nd floor of his midtown headquarters. The mood was tense, conversations muted, everyone waiting for information that would explain the mysterious assault on their company. Marcus Webb, Sterling's CFO, stood at the front of the room with a grim expression. "As of market open, approximately 28% of our outstanding shares have been acquired by unknown entities. The purchases accelerated after midnight, suggesting coordination across multiple time zones." Board member Patricia Hawthorne, the same senator who had attended the previous night's gala, leaned forward in concern. 28%? That's enough to block major decisions. Who has that kind of capital? More troubling, Webb continued. The purchases are continuing. Real-time data shows accumulation hasn't stopped. Sterling studied the trading charts projected on the conference room wall. The pattern was unlike anything he'd seen. Methodical, relentless, perfectly timed to exploit regulatory gaps and market inefficiencies. "Sir," called his head of security, entering the room with an expression of barely controlled panic. "We need to talk privately." Sterling followed him to an adjacent office, his stomach clenching with anticipation of bad news. "We identified the source," the security chief said without preamble. "The purchasing network traces back to a single entity, Meridian Holdings, based in the Cayman Islands. Never heard of them. Who owns Meridian?" "That's where it gets complicated. Meridian is owned by Phoenix Capital, which is owned by 7 different international investment firms, which are owned by..." He paused, checking his notes. "This is going to sound impossible. Just tell me." "Elena Rodriguez." Sterling stared at him. "That's not possible. Elena Rodriguez is a waitress." "No, sir. Elena Rodriguez is worth approximately $47 billion. She's the heir to the Rodriguez shipping fortune, educated at Harvard Business School, and has been building a shadow empire for the past 8 years. The room seemed to tilt around Sterling. 47 billion? Her grandfather built the largest shipping company in Latin America. Her father expanded into tech and finance before dying in a plane crash 5 years ago. She inherited everything, but maintained a public profile as a graduate student to avoid attention. Sterling sat down heavily, his mind struggling to process the information. Why is she targeting my company? According to our intelligence, she's been investigating media consolidation and its impact on democratic institutions. Your company is apparently central to her concerns. Intelligence? What intelligence? His security chief looked uncomfortable. "Sir, we may have underestimated how thoroughly she's researched your operations. Our preliminary investigation suggests she has detailed information about political coordination, market manipulation, regulatory capture." "How detailed?" "She was working your events for 3 months, sir, always in positions where she could observe high-level conversations. If she was recording." Sterling felt nauseous. The previous night's confrontation took on new significance. Her questions about stock symbols, her strange calm under humiliation, the way she'd maneuvered him into providing exactly information she needed. "Get me our lawyers," he ordered. "All of them. And contact our allies in Washington. If she has recordings of private conversations, we need to control the narrative before." His phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was blocked, but something told him he needed to answer. Victoria Sterling. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling." The voice was familiar, quiet, professional, with just a hint of accent. "This is Elena Rodriguez. I believe we met last evening." Sterling's hand tightened on the phone. "What do you want?" "I wanted to personally inform you that as of this morning, I control 41% of Sterling Media Corporation. I'll be calling a shareholder meeting to discuss the company's future direction." "This is illegal. Hostile takeovers require SEC filings. Advance notice." "Nothing I've done violates securities law," Elena interrupted calmly. "I've followed all disclosure requirements to the letter. It's simply that those requirements allowed me to accumulate a controlling interest without triggering premature alerts." Sterling looked around his war room, seeing the faces of executives who were just beginning to understand the magnitude of the disaster. "What do you want?" "Justice, Mr. Sterling. Last night you asked if I knew who you were. Let me return the question. Do you know who I am?" "You're a waitress who inherited money." Elena's laugh was soft, almost sympathetic. "I'm someone who spent 3 months documenting your criminal activities. Someone who recorded conversations about election interference, market manipulation, regulatory capture, and conspiracy to defraud the American people." The words hit Sterling like physical blows. His legs went weak, forcing him to sit down. "Those conversations were private." "They were criminal conspiracies conducted in public spaces," Elena corrected. "I have video and audio recordings of you coordinating with elected officials to subvert antitrust oversight, discussing plans to manipulate stock prices of acquisition targets, and bragging about using your media platforms to spread disinformation." Sterling's vision began to tunnel. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand what happens when someone with real power decides to hold you accountable for your actions." The line went dead. Within minutes, Sterling's world began collapsing with surgical precision. The first wave came from the Securities and Exchange Commission, simultaneous investigations into market manipulation, failure to disclose material information, and potential securities fraud. The investigations were based on anonymous tips that included detailed evidence, specific dates, and recorded conversations. The second wave came from the Department of Justice. Federal prosecutors announced investigations into election interference, conspiracy to violate campaign finance laws, and using media platforms to coordinate with political campaigns. Again, the investigations were supported by extensive evidence that suggested months of careful documentation. The third wave was the most devastating. Elena Rodriguez held a press conference. Standing at a podium in the Plaza Hotel, the same hotel where Sterling had humiliated her 12 hours earlier, Elena faced a room full of reporters who had been summoned by press releases promising revelations about media consolidation and democratic integrity. She no longer looked like a waitress. Dressed in a perfectly tailored business suit, her hair styled by professionals, she projected the kind of authority that came from controlling billions of dollars and having nothing left to hide. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily through the crowded room, "my name is Elena Rodriguez, CEO of Meridian Holdings and controlling shareholder of Sterling Media Corporation." The revelation sent shock waves through the financial press. Reporters began shouting questions, but Elena raised her hand for silence. "For the past 3 months, I have been investigating the systematic corruption that has infected America's media landscape. What I discovered exceeds even my worst expectations." She activated a presentation screen that showed the first of dozens of recorded conversations. Sterling's voice filled the room, crystal clear, discussing plans to coordinate negative coverage of political candidates who opposed media consolidation. "This conversation took place 6 weeks ago at a private fundraiser," Elena explained. "Mr. Sterling is discussing how his news networks will shape public opinion to support regulatory policies that benefit his company's expansion." The second recording showed Sterling coordinating with Senator Hawthorne about antitrust hearings, both of them laughing about the predetermined outcome designed to give the appearance of oversight without actual regulation. This represents a fundamental betrayal of democratic principles, Elena continued. Citizens have a right to honest journalism and fair regulatory oversight. Instead, they're receiving coordinated propaganda designed to serve corporate interests. She played recording after recording, each more damning than the last. Sterling discussing market manipulation tactics, his executives bragging about suppressing negative coverage of environmental disasters. Political officials promising favourable legislation in exchange for positive media coverage. The most disturbing element, Elena said, is how this corruption has been normalised. These individuals discuss subverting democratic institutions as casually as planning dinner parties. They've lost sight of the fact that their actions have consequences for millions of Americans who depend on honest information to make informed decisions. A reporter called out, "Miss Rodriguez, why did you choose to investigate this personally, rather than working with existing oversight agencies?" Elena's smile was slight but significant. Oversight agencies are compromised. Many of the officials responsible for regulating media companies are the same people you heard on those recordings, coordinating with the companies they're supposed to oversee. "What's your end goal?" another reporter asked. "Complete restructuring of Sterling Media Corporation. The company will be broken up, its news divisions will be placed under independent editorial control, and its social media platforms will be subject to transparency requirements that prevent the spread of coordinated disinformation." And Mr. Sterling? Mr. Sterling will face the legal consequences of his actions. I have provided complete evidence packages to federal prosecutors, securities regulators, and congressional oversight committees. The rest is up to our justice system. As Elena concluded her press conference, Sterling watched from his office, his face ashen. Around him, executives and lawyers worked frantically to contain a crisis that had already spiraled beyond any possibility of control. His phone rang constantly with calls from board members, political allies, and media partners, all of them distancing themselves from the sinking ship. Campaign donations were quietly returned, planned meetings cancelled, public endorsements withdrawn with remarkable speed. "Sir," his chief legal counsel said quietly, "we need to discuss your options." Options: resignation, cooperation with federal investigations, plea negotiations. The recordings Ms. Rodriguez released are legally admissible and devastatingly incriminating. Fighting the charges would likely result in decades in federal prison. Sterling looked around his office, seeing his empire crumbling in real time. Stock prices plummeting, advertising contracts cancelled, distribution partners severing relationships. Everything he'd built over 30 years was disappearing in a single day. "How?" he asked quietly. "How did she do this?" His counsel consulted his notes. "According to our investigation, Ms. Rodriguez has been planning this for years. She identified media consolidation as a threat to democratic institutions and spent considerable time studying the key players. When she targeted your company, it wasn't random. She considered you the most vulnerable and influential figure in the consolidation network." "Vulnerable how?" "Ego, sir. Your tendency to treat service workers as invisible made you careless around them. She exploited that blind spot systematically." Sterling remembered the previous evening, the way he'd dismissed Elena as just a waitress, the casual cruelty with which he'd treated her in front of hundreds of witnesses. His own arrogance had been weaponized against him. "The irony," his counsel continued, "is that she was never really hiding. Elena Rodriguez was always Elena Rodriguez. She simply allowed people to make assumptions based on her job rather than her background. And now? Now she controls your company, has evidence of multiple federal crimes, and has the resources to pursue justice through every available legal channel." 3 months later, Sterling Media Corporation no longer existed as an independent entity. Elena Rodriguez had systematically dismantled the company, selling its profitable divisions to competitors who agreed to editorial independence requirements, spinning off its news operations as non-profit entities with transparent funding structures, and shuttering its most problematic platforms entirely. Victoria Sterling himself faced a very different fate. Convicted on 17 federal charges including securities fraud, election interference, and conspiracy to manipulate markets, he was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. His personal fortune, accumulated through decades of corruption, was seized under asset forfeiture laws and used to fund media literacy programs in public schools. Senator Patricia Hawthorne resigned from Congress and faced her own federal charges. Marcus Webb, Sterling's former CFO, cooperated with investigators and received a reduced sentence of 8 years. Dozens of other individuals in Sterling's network faced criminal charges, civil penalties, or professional sanctions. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the broader reform that Elena's investigation triggered. Her evidence led to congressional hearings that actually provided meaningful oversight, resulting in new regulations governing media consolidation, political coordination by news organizations, and transparency requirements for social media platforms. Elena Rodriguez returned to her preferred anonymity, though she was now recognized as one of the most influential figures in contemporary media reform. She continued to work through Meridian Holdings, identifying and dismantling other networks of corruption with the same methodical precision she'd used against Sterling. In interviews, the few she granted, Elena was often asked about her decision to work undercover as a waitress, rather than using her wealth and status to pursue reform through conventional channels. Conventional channels were compromised, she would explain. The people responsible for oversight were part of the system I was investigating. Sometimes the only way to document corruption is to become invisible to those perpetrating it. When asked about her confrontation with Sterling at the charity gala, she would smile slightly. Mr. Sterling asked if I knew who he was. He should have asked who I was. The charity gala where it all began became the subject of numerous case studies in business schools and journalism programs. Students analyzed how Elena had maneuvered Sterling into providing exactly the information she needed, how she'd used his own arrogance against him, and how a single moment of cruelty had triggered the collapse of a media empire. The ballroom at the Meridian Grand Hotel installed a small plaque near the spot where Sterling had humiliated Elena, visible only to those who knew to look for it. It read simply, "Truth serves justice, regardless of uniform." The wait staff at high-end hotels and restaurants across Manhattan began to be treated with notably more respect by wealthy patrons, many of whom had learned that invisibility could be a choice rather than a circumstance, and that underestimating people based on their apparent status could have consequences far beyond social embarrassment. Elena Rodriguez had proven that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one no one bothers to notice, until it's too late to do anything about what they've seen and heard. Have you ever wondered who might be listening when powerful people think their conversations are private? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories of justice served from unexpected places.